All right, today we are going to talk about the barriers of communication. So the learning target for today is that students will identify and model the barriers of communication within the communication process. So we communicate every single day in every single way. However, with communication, sometimes things get misunderstood, whether it's from the person giving the message or the person receiving the message. And these are called barriers. And today we're going to talk about all of the different types of barriers, or at least the most common barriers that occur during the communication process. So first, let's review what we should already know. What is communication? And so we know from reviewing that communication is the act of transferring information from one place to another. Although this is a really simple definition of one thing to another, when we think about how we communicate, there's a lot of different ways that we can communicate, and it becomes really complex and a lot of different venues for miscommunication to occur. And so let's talk about those different types of communication. So types of communication, it can be spoken, it can be nonverbal, it can be written, or it can be visual. So spoken communication is exactly what we're doing here. Someone speaks, someone listens, and then they respond. The nonverbal communication would be essentially with your body. So for example, if someone said, "Hey, we're having mac and cheese for dinner," my response might be. Or if somebody says, "Hey, did you see what Susie wore yesterday?" my response might be. You got a lot of information just from my gestures using nonverbal communication. Written communication might be exactly what it sounds. It could be written down, it could be in a text, it could be in social media, it can be in a news form, things like that. Visual communication actually speaks volumes. The thing that I think of most with visual communication is honestly how you present yourself. Visual communication is what you wear, how people view you, how you view yourself, how you hold yourself, the presence when you walk into a room. Visual communication also comes in the form of entertainment value. So how you communicate visually in a commercial or through aesthetics, things like that. So now that we've reviewed what communication is and the types of communication, we're going to move on to reviewing very quickly the communication process. So the communication process is when there is one person and another person. They are the sender and the receiver. Oh, maybe. So there's the sender and the receiver. So the sender is the person sending the message, also known as the encoder. They are encoding, they are coming up with a message to send to the receiver. And the receiver is the person decoding the message. They're processing what they have just heard. Now within that, during that time, sometimes you might think you had a really great conversation, they totally understood what you said, and you leave that conversation as the decoder, as the receiver of that message, thinking, what did they just say? What did we just talk about? Those are barriers. Oftentimes there's a miscommunication of listening versus hearing. So hearing is the actual sound that you hear. It is the physical noise that you hear. You can hear lots of different conversations, but actually listening to those conversations and digesting that information and comprehending that information, that's listening. When you can hear it, understand it, and apply it. Oftentimes listening doesn't happen because of barriers. So now we're into the bulk of our lesson, and we're going to talk about barriers. Now, as we talk about our barriers, I want you to think about each of these barriers that we're going to talk about in process and a time that you have either been a sender of a message and your message got misconstrued because of a barrier, or a time that you were the receiver and your message got miscommunicated, or you didn't understand the message that was being sent because of barriers. And write these down, because at the end of this lesson, you are going to create your own Powtoon and illustrate for us one of your messages that either was sent and was caught by a barrier and was misunderstood, or a message that you received that was caught by a barrier that was misunderstood. So very quickly, the common barriers of communication are jargon, physical barriers, emotional barriers, a lack of interest, expectations or prejudice, and language and cultural differences. So the very first, use of jargon. I see this very, very often. So with the use of jargon, we use our cell phones sometimes, right? So there are many different things as in this conversation. Hi, are you here? OMWN. Bless you. If I would have seen this conversation, I would have thought someone had just sneezed. So, OMWN, on my way now. If someone didn't understand that, that communication message would have been completely out of the water. So the next message, this is a little more professional one. Can you send that to me, EOBD? I don't know what EOBD is. End of business day. So by understanding the use of jargon, we can have a more clear communication message. Without it, we're lost in translation. So the second type of miscommunication with a barrier would be physical barriers. This really means one person might be over here, another person might be over here, and your message is stuck between those physical barriers. It could be that you are on the second floor of a house and then someone else is downstairs and you're trying to communicate, but you can't hear each other because of the physical barriers of distance. It could be that you're in a busy hallway and you're trying to talk to a friend on one end of the hallway of the school to the other end. You can't understand the messages because of the physical barrier of noise. There are many types of physical barriers. So think about those physical barriers. The physical barrier and the jargon barrier, those are the two most common barriers of communication that we see. So the next type of barrier would just be more physical barriers. Sometimes the physical barriers are there just in general, and sometimes we put them there ourselves. So this next physical barrier is something that we put in front of ourselves very often. Take a look at the Powtoon and see if you can understand which barrier this might be. I see this physical barrier day in and day out. With technology, as useful as it is, sometimes it puts a barrier in between communication from a person to a person in the physical sense. Sometimes we can't hear one another because we have headphones in. Sometimes we can't listen to one another because we're distracted with what's in front of us. Sometimes technology might be a physical barrier in itself and that the sound isn't working or you lose signal, those type of barriers. And so the next barrier would be emotional barriers. This is a really interesting barrier. Sometimes we can't listen or even hear a message from the sender because we are so caught up in ourselves at the moment. Just like the picture illustrates, we might be really sad and we can hear someone trying to console us, but we can't really listen to them because we're so caught up in what was happening. The same with anger. Anger is a really common one, that you are so angry, all you see is red. You don't want to listen to the other person. Another one might be that you are just dazed. You just might be caught up in thought and you're not really listening to what the person has to say. Another barrier is just straight up lack of interest. You don't want to listen to them. I see this a lot with students and their parents, to where parents want to say something and they want their student to listen to them, and the student thinks that they know what's happening and they don't want to hear it. Just like this message here. Can you help me with my project? And the girl is shopping on her laptop. Shopping is way more fun. And another type of barrier would be the expectations. As this student and the teacher, don't you know everything? The student expects that the teacher might know everything, but she doesn't. She might be a keeper of lots of knowledge, but there's a miscommunication there with perceived expectations of what you think you might know and what the actual truth is. It takes that depth of knowledge to really dive in to figure things out. And that segues into the final barrier of language or culture. This is a really common barrier because you have to understand both language and culture. This might be even with heavy accents or the deep-rooted culture of why people do things the way that they do. And it really takes diving into learning about those languages or cultures to really understand those barriers. So a quick review. There is an encoder and a decoder with the message in the middle sending that message, and then the common barriers of communication, and I'll post this so that you can review these. And your assignment is that you are going to create a Powtoon. of a time that you have either been a sender of a message and you were misunderstood because of one of these barriers, or that you were a receiver of a message and that you didn't understand the sender because of one of these barriers. Really think back through and look back through this Powtoon presentation to think about a time that you have really experienced one of these barriers and how that message could have been better received with overcoming those barriers.